Hi, Emily. It's so nice to meet you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is a novel that is really the untold origin story of Frankenstein. It's told from the perspective of Claire Clairmont, who was Mary Shelley's forgotten, or in my view, erased stepsister. Mary Shelley used Claire as a sort of go-between in her marriage to Percy Shelley. Claire was also Lord Byron's lover, and Claire is the person who brought Lord Byron and Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron's personal physician, because of course, who doesn't travel with their own physician these days, to the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland in the summer of 1816. And that is where we have these mythical monsters that are created, Frankenstein, the modern vampire, a lot of romantic poetry that's still read and taught widely today. But there's also the sort of monster of making art and the monsters who walk among us still, which is all very relevant. And this is really Claire's story, and she's 17 and 18 in this novel. And so we really can understand the complicated love that was behind the making of Frankenstein. In 1815, in Indonesia, Mount Tambora erupted. And it spewed miles and miles of thick ash. And this ash carried so far and blocked so much of the solar rays that everything was very dark in the summer of 1816 and very, very cold. It caused a global climate disaster. And this affected everybody, not just because it was chilly and they had packed for summer vacation and instead were wearing lots of layers of wool, but because even in the spring, there was snow in London, there were typhoons, there were earthquakes, there were hurricanes all over. And because of the cold weather and because the sun was blocked, crops didn't grow. So there was a food shortage all over. It caused devastating starvation. There were what were called the blood and bread riots in the UK. In Germany, they were making bread out of sawdust because there was no flour. There was nothing to feed the cattle either. They didn't know what had caused such turmoil in the weather of 1816 until the 1970s. And so this didn't come out for a long, long time. And so imagine being at that time and not having any idea what is happening, you know? But in this backdrop, we know that this is when Lord Byron challenges everybody who's present to write a scary story. And it is from that, and he only challenges them because of this, pervasive darkness and gloom, and they're stuck inside. And you have to imagine like the Gothic setting of like candles dripping and, chandeliers being lighted and everybody curled up by the fire and writing. And that's how we come to have these famous monster tales.
In the novel, they're sort of stuck at Lake Geneva, and it felt a little bit like a COVID pandemic situation.
100%. When
Yeah.
I was researching it and writing it, I mean, I started research, I can tell you how I came to write this. But as I was researching post-pandemic, I really kept thinking, ooh, this has real pandemic vibes of people are trapped inside. They don't really know what's happening outside. Like it feels pretty scary. And at the same time, they're trying to make art. At the same time, because of the insular nature of where they are and this feeling of being trapped, they're already complicated love and intermingling, and sort of polyamory is really like coming to even more of a head. And so I definitely had that pandemic feeling, and it only increased this feeling of though I was writing in 1816, it just felt so current between celebrity culture and the political crisis and sort of people abusing their power. And there were so many parallels in this.
Yeah, something that who says it? Shelley. He describes the world as being topsy-turvy,
Mm.
to describe what's happening. And I guess when the world feels like it's topsy-turvy, maybe it gives like you permission to also like behave in ways that you maybe normally wouldn't, or make decisions that are a little bit like different from how you would like prescribe your own identity, especially for Claire.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think that that certainly was true for all of us during the pandemic, like what counted, what didn't count, how we rationalize our behavior. And I think that this was a pre-existing condition for Shelley and Mary and Byron. but was probably heightened by their surroundings and the insular weather and the unpredictability. Percy Shelley was prone, they called him Mad Shelley when he was growing up. He was fiery. That's sort of a nice way of putting it, I guess. And the lake at Lake Geneva suddenly rises up and there's sort of a typhoon. And we just never know, these characters never know when this weather is going to strike. What was great for me was so many weather records still exist. So I could pull up, the London weather from the 1800s and say, oh, it snowed on this day and it shut the city down. That is when Claire will spend the night at Byron's house for the first time. How confident Byron was walking through the sun, rain, the icy mess slopped upon us. It was foolish to wait for blue sky and heat. I needed to do as he did and embrace whatever weather was given to us. And so I think part of it is that gender of like these men who just feel like they have complete agency to walk through the world and make the art that they want to make, and they don't have to take care of the baby that Mary Shelley's taking care of. And they don't have to run everybody's errands like Claire is doing because she's just a mere mortal among artists, and so maybe Claire by the end, has watched this and she is trying to have part of the journey that Claire has for this whole novel is really trying to get any semblance of choice and control and agency in her life, which, given the time period, her age, her financial situation, and the fact that, she can't go home to her home of origin because she and Mary have been pretty much kicked out, and her home is really with Mary and Shelley. And that's a very complicated, as you know, situation that she lives in a world without choice, is how she phrases it. And that's also how we are with the weather. We don't get to choose the weather. It just upon us. How I came to write this was, I read in 2009, I read an op-ed written by Guillermo del Toro, who obviously just did his version of Frankenstein. And I've been on tour for a couple of weeks and people keep asking if we're really good friends because of the timing of this novel. It's actually quite funny to me. We are not yet very close, maybe one day. But I read his article, which was called Why Vampires Never Die. And it was really about the mythical creatures that summer. And I went immediately to to learn about that summer. And as soon as you read about that summer in any article, it pulls up Claire Clairmont's name because she was the person who got everybody there. She introduced Byron and Shelley, and they had sort of a literary bromance. I went to my 1831 edition of Frankenstein, which is like the regular version that people read in school now. And in that preface, the publisher asked her to talk about the origin of how she came to write the book. And she talks about the summer of 1816 and being on the shores of Lake Geneva and how Lord Byron had challenged them to write a scary story. Mary says, there were four of us there that summer, me and Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and Lord Byron's personal physician. And so I thought to myself, well, where's Claire? And so I thought, what happened to make Mary Shelley write Claire out of that story? And that was the starting point of this novel for me. And really, because that was the lens through which I examined all of these centuries of writing and analysis and the art that was made and the letters that survived and the surviving journals, because there are a lot of surviving journals. Even some of Claire's journals survived, except for the journal she kept in 1816. I
Mm.
believe it was taken or destroyed. So part of what Love and Other Monsters is asking is like, who might have taken that journal and why? And so because I was really looking at everything through that lens, I could drown out some of that noise. I needed to learn the noise. I really needed to read everything that I could, not just the art that was produced, but some of the criticism, some of the theses, like the academic, theses that are still written. I was writing with academics in Australia and all over the world, and Mary Shelley experts, and reading everything that I could. But there were some very big sort of, I would say, like what became plot points along the way when my research sort of started to share or reveal to me why Claire might have been written out of the story.
Yeah. The power to just sort of disappear somebody is incredible.
Right, but what's funny to me is it's sort of like the way that, you try to teach, like I have four kids and try to tell them that like everything you write is going to be around forever. And it's hard to imagine that the same way that I'm not quite sure what Mary Shelley was thinking when, she posthumously went back into like after Shelley died, after Percy Shelley died, she went back into his poems that he had dedicated to Claire. And she changed the dedications and changed, some of the wording so that it wouldn't reference Claire, but we can see the scratch marks. It's quite funny to me that, like, what sort of magical thinking was going on that she was like, no one will know. But in fact, she's right, right? She won. She became so big and so famous, and so was Byron and his reputation. And Percy Shelley somehow made it into the canon with Keats, that Claire is just this ghost. Claire doesn't have a child, and Mary has a child. And I think Mary is watching with a bit of envy, thinking that because Claire doesn't have a child, she isn't really tied to the earth the way that Mary is. And so she feels like Claire has all of this expansive time and can glide through. And meanwhile, Claire is thinking like Mary has a sense of purpose. Mary is always like this very driven person. And like, what am I? She's defined, all these people are defined by what they do. They're writers, they're mothers, they're doctors. And what's my purpose aside from being like the muse to these people? And so I think it comes back to that line that's very early in the novel. How siblings see us is how we come to see ourselves. And if you are a sibling, and have like if you have siblings, that is something that I know for me, I had to sort of think like, am I how my siblings see me, or am I like where do I tease out the real me and the me that other people see? And obviously your siblings are your first people that you're around so much, like your first peer group. And so it can be really complicated. And I think for Mary and Claire, they were built very differently. Physically, they were very differently. Um, they were raised in this very unconventional household, but they have this very deep love story and this really complicated love. In some ways, as you know from reading the book, like I really believe that Mary sort of created Claire in some ways, and then she grew terribly resentful when Claire wasn't exactly how she wanted her to be or had a life of her own, which is, of course, Frankenstein.
Hmm.
And it's also parenting and it's also art. Like when we make something, it isn't ours anymore.
Yeah.
And I think Mary had a hard time with that, right? Although in some ways, like the crossing out that I was talking about, yeah, it wasn't Percy's anymore. She could do with it what she wanted because, he wasn't there to defend it. But there is that toggling between closeness and competition. I think at one point in one of Mary's letters, she says, it isn't that I don't want my sister to be happy and successful. I do. I would just like her to be slightly, ever so much, ever so slightly less happy and successful than I, which is like
Honest.
pretty honest. But Claire reads it, you can imagine reading that and thinking like, ooh, that's not so loving. And at the same time, Mary has put Claire in an absolutely impossible position in her marriage with Mary and Shelley. And I describe Claire as dangerously loyal, and that's what I think she is. All love stories become ghost stories because it's true for the characters in the novel, and it's true for us. I mean, everybody we love will become a ghost of memory. And that's something that I always come back to that. I mean, it's real. That's the joy and pain of being a person and what it means to accept being a person and being aware that this time on earth is finite. And we don't get to say how or if we are remembered. And how we're remembered, is something that like other people choose for us, even in our art.
And something, the way I also took it by the end was the way Claire also thinks a lot about like who she once was, who she is now, like the many versions of her that have existed. That goes back to like truth and identity. But even if like the telling of a love story, it's like the telling of a past self or the telling of somebody else's past self. So even if they are both of you are alive together or not, it's like whatever that story is, it's already passed.
Yes. Right.
Surrounding you like a ghost, but like not tangible.
I can remember saying to one of my kids when they were little, like I really, my grandfather had died, and I said, I'm just so sad because, he would really love to. He knew you all when you were little, but he would love to be here, and I didn't know his parents, and it's just such a sad time. Is so sad in some ways. Like we don't all get to be together at the same time. And my 4-year-old said if we did, it would be very crowded. And I said, you're right, it really would be. But that sort of, I hold that with me a lot because I think, like, when I think about everybody's selves who are in the room all the time, it is kind of crowded in there. Like, we are all in there together, and we might fantasize that it's just like the present day us in whatever composed form that we are. But like, you're still your 14-year-old self, and your 7-year-old self, and your 23-year-old self. We don't know if we get to have the 80-year-old self necessarily, but maybe that person's in there. And so I really wanted Claire, I structured the novel with the 80-year-old Claire looking back on her life to have that sort of Kierkegaardian idea of life is lived forward but understood backwards. And I wanted her to be able to do that, and have all those selves that we all hold.